In the Nevada Territory, in the winter of 1887, a man died on the road between Elko, the ghost settlement, the old maps called Harrow Flat. He was found by a freight driver at first light, his body curled against a basalt outcropping off the main track. Not wounded, not robbed, simply stopped in the cold as old men sometimes are when the heart decides it has done enough. The county deputy recorded him as one Ezra Pruitt, age somewhere past 70, occupation unknown, effects consisting of a wool coat, a pair of cracked boots, and $4 in coin. The deputy pried the boots off to check for hidden money, which was the custom, and what fell out of the left one was not money. It was a key. Heavy iron, 3 inches long. The bow stamped with a simple cross-hatch that suggested manufacture sometime in the 1850 seconds. The bit worn smooth on one side from repeated use, and then roughened again with rust from long disuse. The deputy held it up, turned it once, and set it on the table beside the $4. He entered it in the ledger as a found effect, with no corresponding lock. Then he moved on to other business, because a dead drifter's iron key was a thing without consequence. He was wrong about that. Ren Alcott arrived in Elko 6 days after Ezra Pruitt was buried in the county plot at the edge of town with a wooden marker and no mourners. She was 27 years old, slight in build, with dark auburn hair worn up in a loose braid, and the hands of someone who had spent years working stone and iron rather than needles and thread. She carried a worn canvas satchel, a leather tool roll tied across it, and a letter of introduction to the deputy from a circuit judge in Salt Lake City, a letter that explained, in formal and somewhat embarrassed language, that the deceased Ezra Pruitt had been her father's oldest friend, had asked her before he died to find Pruitt and hear whatever it was Pruitt had been carrying. The deputy read the letter twice and looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who finds the paperwork of the dead more complicated than the dead themselves. He didn't carry much, the deputy said. $4 coin, a wool coat, and this. He pushed the key across the desk. Ren picked it up. She turned it in her fingers the way the deputy had, but she held it longer. The crosshatch stamping. She knew the shape of iron worked in the 1850 seconds, had known it since she was 9 years old, and her father first put a lock in her hands and told her to learn it the way a word is learned, from the inside out. He was a locksmith, she said. My father. The deputy waited. Ezra Pruitt was his partner. Before the war, she set the key back down between them, and her voice was level and plain. My father said Pruitt would know which door. If I were to tell you this story was finished at that desk, you would close this window, and I would not blame you. What Ren found behind the door that key opened rearranged the ownership of nearly 3,000 acres of Nevada rangeland, settled a debt 29 years overdue, and undid the most carefully constructed act of paper fraud that territory had ever seen. If that interests you, stay close. The deputy directed her to Harrow Flat, 14 miles east and north by the freight road, accessible by wagon in the warm months, but in January nothing more than a pair of frozen ruts through sagebrush and cracked basalt. He offered her the use of a mule. She accepted, and she added the loan to the list of small debts she intended to settle before she left Nevada, because she had been raised in a household where debts were counted carefully and cleared the same way, and she did not propose to leave that habit behind, simply because the debt in question was a borrowed animal rather than a bill of materials. She asked the deputy one other question before she left his office. Did anyone else come looking for Pruitt before he died or after? The deputy considered this. No one, he said. He came in alone and died alone. The freight man who found him didn't know him. He paused. Why? Because a man who carries a key in his boot for however many years has made a decision about carrying it, she said. I want to know whether anyone else knew he had made that decision. The deputy looked at her for a moment. You think someone might have been looking for it? I think it is worth knowing, she said. He had no answer for her, and the answer turned out to be no, as far as she was ever able to determine. Whatever Caspar Veldt's associates had known or suspected about the contents of the Harrow Flat shop in 1860, they had either not known the shop still stood 30 years later, or had not believed the key still existed. The key had been the one thing they had not been able to falsify, because the key was in Pruitt's boot, and Pruitt was not a man who held still to be searched. The road to Harrow Flat was 14 miles of frozen ground and cold wind off the Ruby Mountains, and the mule the deputy loaned her was a gray animal of considered opinions who preferred to walk at the pace of a man thinking through a difficult problem. Wren did not argue with the mule. She had grown up in a household where patience was not an aspiration but a working method, and the flat gray sky and the flat gray sage and the flat gray basalt of that January passage gave her time to think through what she knew and what she did not. She knew that Ezra Pruitt had died with a key in his boot and had been traveling toward Elko when he died, which meant he had been going somewhere with the intention of giving it to someone. She knew that her father had spent the last years of his life with the diminished quietness that she had taken for grief after her mother died, but which she now understood as something else, something more specific, the particular quietness of a man who has been wronged in a manner he cannot prove and cannot stop thinking about. She did not yet know what the key fit. That was the thing the mule's slow pace gave her room to consider, and she considered it without hurrying to a conclusion, which was how her father had taught her to approach any mechanism. You do not assume the shape of the interior, he had said. You let the tool tell you. The lock will show you what it wants if you are willing to wait for it. Harrow Flat had been a silver camp in 1858 and 1859, a brief bloom of maybe 200 souls who left when the ore petered out and the winter came hard. What remained in 1887 was a row of 7 structures in various states of collapse, a stone well that still held water, 2 rusted barrel hoops half buried in frozen ground, and at the far end of the settlement's single road, a building that was different from the others. It was a locksmith's shop. She knew it the way you know a person's work when you have grown up watching the same work done. The door was oak, a full 2 inches thick and close-grained, hung on iron pintle hinges she recognized as the kind her father had preferred, the heavier pattern that did not loosen with seasonal swelling. The windows were shuttered with board and pinned from inside with wooden pegs, not simply fallen in the way the other settlement windows had fallen or been removed by later scavengers. Someone had closed this place deliberately, had taken the time to shutter and latch before leaving, had left it not abandoned in despair but sealed in intention, which was a different thing entirely. She stood before the door in the January light and studied the lock before she reached for the key. The escutcheon plate was brass, which had tarnished to the dark of dried blood, but was still perfectly fitted to its mortise. No gap at the edges, no play in the plate. The keyhole was the elongated oval shape characteristic of a 7-lever mechanism, the kind that required a specific key profile to engage all levers in sequence, and could not be picked in under an hour by anyone who did not know the exact configuration of the levers inside. Her father had built a 7-lever rim lock once for a bank client in Colorado, and she had watched him set the lever heights, had held the blank while he marked it, had driven the first 2 cuts herself under his direction. The memory of that afternoon was specific in her body, in her hands, in a way that fewer and fewer things were as time moved her further from the years when she had worked beside him. She put the key in the lock. The bit engaged the first lever cleanly. The second. Then a resistance that was rust and cold, and the expansion of iron over decades, not the resistance of a misfit, simply the argument of time. And she worked the key with a patience she had been taught by a man who said that a lock argued with your wrist only when you had not yet understood what it wanted. You did not push, you listened and persuaded. It opened on the fourth slow turn. The air that came out was not the wet rot smell of an abandoned structure. It was cold and dry and tasted of iron filings and linseed oil and a particular mineral sharpness she associated with the slurry used for lapping metal surfaces. The smell of a locksmith's shop. The smell of her childhood exactly preserved. She stood in the doorway and looked. The workbench ran the full length of the left wall, 8 feet of heavy oak plank, scarred with file marks and tool rings, and the circular burns of oil lamps held low over close work. Above it, hanging from a wooden rail on iron hooks, hung the tools in their accustomed order: punches, broaches, files of a dozen cuts from coarse to needle-fine, a jeweler's saw frame with the blade still fitted, a drill brace still clamped to a center bit. On the bench itself, arranged with the deliberate tidiness of someone who had expected to return, were 3 partially finished lock blanks, in various stages of machining, a 4-inch vise, bolted to the right end of the bench, a brass-handled hammer of a size her father had called the persuader, and a small tin cup that had held in another century. The remnants of black lead lubricant for working tight-fitting mechanisms. She recognized the tin cup specifically. It was the same shape and manufacture as the one that had sat on her father's bench in Salt Lake City, and the one before that in the rented shop in Ogden, and presumably before that in whatever first shop he had shared with Ezra Pruitt in the years before she was born. A craftsman's particular supplies, carried from one place to the next, until they are too worn to carry further. The cup was past worn. It had been left here and not replaced, which told her that Pruitt had not worked this bench after he sealed the shop. He had closed it once and not come back, and the life of the shop had stopped at the instant of that closing. At the far end of the bench was a shallow wooden tray, the kind used for sorting finished keys before tagging them for delivery to customers. In it were 11 keys, each tagged with a small card on a length of cotton string. The cards bore numbers, not names, which meant the corresponding lock records were in the files, and the files were in the cabinet. Someone had organized all of it, with the expectation that the filing system would make sense to whoever eventually needed to find something in it. She did not touch the keys. Yet she turned and looked at the room entire. Against the right wall was a cabinet of shallow drawers, perhaps 16 drawers in 4 columns of 4, the sort used to store lock mechanisms, and key blanks sorted by diameter and material. Each drawer fitted with a small brass pull. The pulls were tarnished green-black with age, but intact. Every one of them, which meant no drawer had been forced. Above the cabinet, nailed to the wall, on a cut nail that had held 30 years without pulling through the plank, was a single sheet of paper in a thin wooden frame. She crossed the room and read it. It was a notice of survey dated the 12th of September, 1858. It described in the cramped legal hand of a territorial land office clerk a parcel of land comprising 2,940 acres lying east of the Humboldt River, bounded north by a ridgeline designated in the survey as the Pruitt and Alcott Grant. Joint title registered in the names of Ezra Pruitt and one Thomas Alcott of Salt Lake City. Her father's name. She stood very still for a moment, and then she read it again, because in her experience a document did not become more or less true on the second reading, but your own capacity to receive what it said sometimes improved. Thomas Alcott, her father, joint holder of nearly 3,000 acres of Nevada rangeland, registered in 1858. She thought of the rented house in Colorado. She thought of the borrowed bench smaller than the one she was standing before, now fitted into the back of a room that smelled of other people's cooking. She thought of the way he had worked in the evenings when the regular orders were done, making things no one had commissioned: a small iron box, a set of graduated key blanks in brass, a lock mechanism of unusual intricacy that he had filed and fitted and refiled over the course of a whole winter, and then set in a wooden case. Objects made against a grief he never fully named, as if the hands could speak when the voice had decided. Silence was the only safe register. He had died in 1884, believing he owned nothing. He had spent the last decade of his life in a rented house in Colorado, working a borrowed bench, sending what he could to Wren and her younger brother after their mother died. He had never mentioned Nevada land. He had never mentioned a joint survey. He had, 3 weeks before he died, pressed her hand and told her only that if she ever found Ezra Pruitt, she should listen to what the old man had to say about the first years, because there were things Pruitt knew that needed to be passed to her before they were lost. Now she understood what he had meant and why he had not told her plainly. He had not known plainly. He had suspected. He had sent her, not to claim, but to learn. And what she was learning, this cold-sealed room on a January afternoon in 1887, was that the learning was only beginning. There was more in that cabinet than a survey notice. She worked the drawers in order starting from the top left. Most held what they were built to hold: lock blanks sorted by diameter and material, key stock in brass and iron, a box of tumblers packed in sawdust. The fourth drawer from the bottom on the right side held something different. It held a bundle of papers tied with waxed cord, and on the top sheet, in her father's handwriting, a single line: "For Ezra, in case I go first." Her father had been here. She had not known that. He had been in this shop, perhaps in the very year he and Pruitt surveyed the land, perhaps years later, and he had left these papers in Pruitt's keeping with the understanding that if Thomas Alcott died before the debt was settled, Ezra Pruitt would know what to do. Pruitt had grown old and had not done it, or had not been able to, or had been afraid of men who had more legal paper than he had, and in the end he had put the key in his boot and started walking toward Elko to find someone who could finish what he and Thomas Alcott had started 30 years before. She carried the bundle to the bench and untied the waxed cord with careful hands. The cord itself was the same waxed linen her father had used for bundling finished key blanks before delivery, and the knot was the flat reef knot he had tied the same way his entire working life. She knew his knots, the way she knew his handwriting, the way she knew the sound his file made against brass at the end of a long stroke. There was a particular intimacy in the knowledge of a craftsman's small habits, and standing in the cold afternoon light of a room that had preserved them intact, she felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders like the cold itself. She breathed once. Then she opened the bundle. There were 9 documents inside. She read them in the order they had been written, beginning with a letter dated March of 1860, 2 years after the survey. The letter was from her father to Ezra Pruitt, and it described in precise and angry language a visit from an attorney representing a land company called the Meridian Consolidated Land and Cattle Association, incorporated in the territory of Nevada by charter in 1859. The attorney had produced a deed of conveyance recorded at the Territorial Land Office in Carson City, showing that the parcel designated as the Pruitt and Alcott Grant had been purchased in full by Meridian Consolidated on the 3rd of November, 1859, for the sum of $120. Her father had not signed any such deed. He said so in plain language. He had been in Salt Lake City on the 3rd of November, 1859. He had never heard of Meridian Consolidated. He had never received any sum, certainly not $60 for his half of nearly 3,000 acres of rangeland that, even in 1860, was worth 20 times that amount per acre. The signature on the deed was a forgery. He was certain of it. He had written to the Territorial Land Office and been informed that the deed was properly recorded and that challenges to recorded instruments must be brought in territorial court at the cost of the challenger. He had written to a lawyer in Carson City who had advised him that the case was not without merit, but that litigation would cost him more than he was likely to recover. Without proof that the signatures were false, he had proof. The second document in the bundle was a sworn affidavit, witnessed and notarized before a justice of the peace in Salt Lake City, attesting that Thomas Alcott had been present and working at a named address in Salt Lake City on the 3rd and 4th of November, 1859, the dates of the alleged conveyance. 3 witnesses had signed it. Their names were legible and their occupations given. 2 were tradesmen known to the justice of the peace. Personally, there were 6 more documents in the bundle. Each one was a piece of the same story told from a different angle. There was a letter from a clerk at the Territorial Land Office, who had written apparently in response to a direct inquiry from her father, noting that the Meridian Consolidated deed had been submitted for recording by an attorney named Caspar Veld, and that the recording fee had been paid in gold coin, not in a draft, which was unusual for a transaction of that size. There was a copy of the Meridian Consolidated Charter, which listed its officers, and one of them was Caspar Veld himself, listed as both the company's legal counsel and a founding shareholder, which meant the attorney who submitted the fraudulent deed had a direct financial interest in the land it transferred. There was a letter from Ezra Pruitt, undated but written in an old man's careful hand, describing his own attempts to challenge the conveyance in the 1,870 seconds and the response he had received, which was nothing, and the visit he had subsequently received from a man employed by Meridian Consolidated who had suggested. That old man who made trouble about things that were settled by law sometimes found that the law settled them in return. He had stopped pushing after that. By the time Wren reached the last document, it was late afternoon, and the light through the shuttered windows had gone from the thin gold of a January sun to the flat gray of the hour before dark. She had not eaten since morning, and the cold of the shop, which she had stopped noticing midway through the second document, had returned to her awareness in the form of fingers that moved more slowly than she wanted. She worked them against each other without looking down, and continued reading. The last document was the original survey plat, folded and refolded many times until it had grown soft along the creases and the intersections of folds had worn to near transparency. The kind of softness that comes from a document handled with great care over a long period rather than pulled out and put away carelessly. Pruitt had handled this paper many times. He had taken it out and looked at it in the dark of whatever room he had been living in the years when looking at it was the only thing he could do, and then he had folded it back and put it away, because looking at it was not the same as acting on it, and he had not been able to act on it. She unfolded it on the bench and weighted its corners with the brass-handled hammer and the vice jaw, and a brooch punch and the tin cup. The survey lines were crisp on the original ink, even where the paper had softened. The names were clear. The parcel was described with the exactitude of men who knew that land was truth only when it was written precisely, because they had been craftsmen all their working lives, and they understood that the difference between a lock that held and a lock that did not was a question of 1/100ths of an inch. Thomas Alcott and Ezra Pruitt had understood that about surveys, as they had understood it about locks. They had done the work correctly. The fraud had come after. She stood at the bench in the failing light with the survey plat in front of her and the 9 documents arranged to its left in the order she had read them. and she understood with the completeness of a thing that has been turning in the back of the mind for days and has now arrived at a conclusion. She stayed in that shop until she had read every document twice, and then she sat on the edge of the bench in the failing gray light and went through the logic of it a third time, not because she doubted what the paper said, but because she had been raised to verify rather than assume, and the habit was too old to set aside now. The shape of the fraud was not complicated. It was the ordinary shape of such things: a forged signature, a cooperative land office, an attorney with interests on both sides of the transaction, and two men far enough from the territorial capital that challenging a recorded deed in court would cost them more than they could afford. The fraud did not require genius. It required only that the men it robbed had no means to fight paper with paper, and that the land office was willing to record an instrument without examining it too carefully, and that the attorney who submitted it would not be examined too carefully either. Kasperveld had been dead since 1878, she learned in subsequent days, from the county records in Elko and from the circuit court register in Carson City, which she wrote to for copies of any proceedings involving Meridian Consolidated Land and Cattle. Meridian Consolidated had dissolved in 1882, when the rangeland it held proved drier than its investors had hoped, and the cattle operation that had been its stated purpose failed to produce the returns the shareholders had projected. The land had been sold in 3 parcels at public auction in the summer of 1882 to satisfy the company's debts, and the parcels had passed through 2 subsequent owners over the following 2 years before being purchased in 1884 by a ranching partnership out of Sacramento called the Reyes brothers, Domingo and Luis Tapiles, who ran cattle on the eastern portion and leased the central grassland to a neighboring operation for grazing at a seasonal rate. Domingo Reyes was 61 years old and had been in Nevada cattle since he was 20. He had come up from Sonora with his brother Luis in 1855 and had spent 30 years learning the particular arithmetic of land and water and weather that governed survival in the high desert, and he had survived it because he was a careful man who understood that most of what threatened a cattle operation was not drought or disease but paper. Bad paper. Paper that looked right and was wrong. He had dealt with enough bad paper in his time that when a woman appeared at his ranch house door in February of 1887, carrying a canvas satchel and a bundle of documents tied with waxed cord, he did not turn her away or call for his brother, or ask what she wanted before he had heard it. He set a second cup on the kitchen table and told her to sit. She did not accuse him of anything. She laid the documents out in the order. She had arranged them over the previous 2 weeks in her Elko hotel room, beginning with the survey plat and ending with the Pruitt letter. And she let him read. He was a slow reader but a precise one, which meant he was the right kind. He read the survey plat twice, tracing the parcel boundaries with one finger. He read the 1860 letter from her father, with his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and he set the cup back down without drinking from it. He read the affidavit of alibi and held it up in the window light, as though the paper itself might add something the ink had not. When he had read all 9 documents, he set the stack back in the order she had given it to him and put his hands flat on the table on either side of it. "The Veldt deed," he said. "Was forged," she said. "My father did not sign it and was not present in the territory when it was recorded." There was a long silence in which the coffee cooled and a log settled in the iron stove, and the wind came against the south wall of the house with a sound like a hand laid flat against glass. "We bought this land from the auction," he said. "We paid the assessed value. I know that. I am not asking for the land." He looked at her. She returned the look without adjustment. "How much did your operation take from this parcel, in cattle and lease income over the time you have held it?" she asked. He named a figure after a moment's consideration. She had expected it to be somewhat higher, and said so, and explained the grazing rate she had found in the county assessor's records for comparable parcels in the same years. He listened without interrupting, which told her something useful about him. She said, "I am asking for the rent that was owed on this land from 1882 forward, at the fair rate established by the county assessor for comparable parcels in the same period. That is the debt this operation has been carrying without knowing it, because the original deed that gave Meridian Consolidated title to transfer was not valid. I am also asking for a quitclaim deed acknowledging that the original Meridian Consolidated conveyance was irregular, so that the territorial record reflects what actually happened. My father's name should be on a document in Carson City that says what was done to him. He was quiet for a long time." Through the window behind him she could see the eastern pasture, the frozen grass, the far ridgeline where the survey boundary ran. "You could ask for more," he said. "I know what I could ask for," she said. The Reyes brothers' attorney reviewed the documents over the course of 3 days. On the 4th day, he delivered a letter to Wren at the Elko Hotel, where she had taken a room at the rate of 40 cents per night. The letter acknowledged the irregularity of the Meridian Consolidated deed of conveyance and offered a sum in settlement that was $412 short of the figure she had calculated as the fair grazing rental for the period in question. She wrote back in her own hand without an attorney, explaining the arithmetic by which she had arrived at her figure and noting that the 1878 Elko County Assessor's rate for comparable rangeland grazing rights was a matter of public record and not open to revision by the party that owed the debt. She included a copy of the assessor's published rate table, which she had obtained from the county clerk's office for the cost of 2 hours of her own time and 15 cents for the copies. The Reyes brothers' attorney took 4 more days. Then he delivered a bank draft and a quitclaim deed properly executed. The sum was not a fortune. $412 was what she had to argue back from the initial offer, which she did by post, through the Elko Hotel over the course of 2 weeks. She did not enjoy the negotiation. She was not built for argument and did not find satisfaction in it. What she had instead was arithmetic and patience, and the two together turned out to be more than the Reyes brothers' attorney had expected from a woman writing letters in her own hand from a rented room at 40 cents a night. Wren was not a wealthy woman after she deposited the bank draft in Salt Lake City in March of 1887. She was not a landed woman. She was exactly what she had been in January when she stepped off the southbound stage in Elko with a canvas satchel and a letter from a circuit judge, a 27-year-old locksmith's daughter with skilled hands, and a clear understanding of what was owed. The debt that her father had died believing he would never collect was collected. The quitclaim deed, filed at the Nevada Territorial Land Office in Carson City, corrected the public record so that any future search of that parcel would find not a clean and uncontested conveyance, but a notation of the irregular original, the affidavit that proved the fraud, and the subsequent acknowledgement of the irregularity by the current holder. It would not give Thomas Alcott his land back. It would not give Ezra Pruitt his last years without fear. It could not undo the 30 years of diminished circumstance that a forged signature and a corrupt attorney had inflicted on 2 men who had done nothing wrong, except trust that a survey plat filed with the Territorial Land Office was a thing that held. What it could do was say in the plain and permanent language of the official record that they had been right and the document that displaced them had been wrong. That was not nothing. A man who has been called a liar by the machinery of law for 30 years and then has the record corrected in his absence has been restored to something. It is not everything. It is something. Wren returned to Harrow Flat one more time before she left Nevada. She went in late February, when the cold had eased enough that the road was navigable without breaking ice at every low spot, and the mule was more willing than it had been in January. Or perhaps she had simply learned the pace it preferred and stopped arguing with it in her mind. The shop was as she had left it. She had closed the shutters again when she left and relocked the door. The lock had engaged cleanly on the second turn, which told her the mechanism had benefited from the work she had done on it the first time. A small amount of powdered graphite worked into the levers to replace 30 years of evaporated oil. The technique her father had called listening with your hands, because the lock would tell you what it needed if you paid attention. The deputy had offered to hold the shop's contents in county custody until someone determined what to do with them, and she had written to him from the hotel, asking him to release them into her care, which he did without argument. She made 2 trips with the borrowed mule. She kept the tools and the lock blanks and the survey plat and the bundled documents. She kept the 11 tag keys from the shallow sorting tray, though she never found the locks they fit. Perhaps those locks were in other sealed rooms, in other settlements that the silver boom had swallowed. Perhaps they were simply waiting, as her father's key had been waiting, for the person who knew enough to look. She crated the cabinet of drawers and the workbench and arranged with a freight hauler out of Elko to ship them south to Salt Lake City, where her younger brother had taken up their father's trade and was working a small bench on a rented street corner. The tools would be useful to him. The bench was sound old oak that had survived 30 years, sealed in a Nevada winter without a crack. There was, near the bottom of the packing crate, one more thing she sent him. She wrote him a letter to go with it, and in the letter, she said only that the object enclosed was a rim lock, 7-lever, brass-faced, made by their father's hands, and that she thought he should have it on his bench where he could see it when he worked. She said it kept time in the way that old locks do, not by hours but by the quality of what was inside, which held as long as the metal held, and the key was kept by someone who understood its value. She did not explain more than that. The lock said the rest. The key she kept herself, on a length of cord, around her neck, under her dress, not as sentiment, as a record of a specific kind of knowledge, the kind that requires patience and precision, and the willingness to work a reluctant mechanism until it understands you mean to open it, no matter how long it has been shut. She wore it for the rest of her life. Have you ever found something tucked away in a long-forgotten place that turned out to hold more than anyone expected? Leave your story below. There is another account from this territory waiting just past this one, of a woman and a hidden thing, and a wrong that took longer than a lifetime to right. The deputy in Elko retired in 1891 and took up ranching near the Ruby Mountains. In his retirement, he recorded in a small journal now held by the Elko County Historical Society a few memories of cases he had found notable. One entry, dated 1893, read as follows. A woman came in January of 1887 for a dead man's key. I thought nothing of it. She thought everything of it. That is generally the difference between a man who keeps records and a woman who reads them. Whether he understood the full weight of what had happened in the weeks after she left his office is unclear from the journal. The entry was brief, and he moved on quickly to other matters. The locksmith shop at Harrow Flat stood for 3 more winters, and then the roof came in under the weight of the snow in the winter of 1890. By 1895, the walls had followed. By 1900, the site was indistinguishable from the basalt and sagebrush around it, the oak lumber salvaged for firewood long since, the iron fittings scattered by the freeze-thaw cycles until they were simply rust in the soil. The survey plat and the bundled documents are in an archive in Salt Lake City. The quitclaim deed is in the Nevada Territorial Records, filed under the parcel number from the original Pruitt and Alcott grant. The bank draft was spent on tools and rent, and her brother's first proper bench, the kind that does not wobble when you set a vise. The brass-handled hammer is on that bench now. It has been on every bench in that family's trade since. Some forms of evidence are not meant to be displayed. They are meant to be used, day after day, by hands that learned the trade from someone who learned it from someone who believed that the truest things a person could make were things that held, things that kept, things that opened only for the key that earned them. Ezra Pruitt was buried in the Elko County plot without a marked stone. In 1889, a stone was placed there, paid for by Wren Alcott, bearing his name and the dates 1812 to 1887, and no other inscription, because the right words for what he had carried and what he had tried to do were not the kind that fit on a stone. The key lay in the cold iron dark for 30 years, and waited. It found the right hand in the end. That is what keys do when they are made well.